И на этой последней сессии будут выступать Йорг Хайзер, соредактор журнала «Фриз» и издатель журнала «Фриз», куратор и теоретик искусства. Доклад его называется «Тирания интимности. Интимность тирании». И в этом докладе он будет исследовать влияние работы Ричарда Зеннетта «Смерть публичного человека» на перформативные концептуальные практики. I presented you.
Okay, sorry. Now it's on? Yes. It was really interesting for me to follow the discussion earlier on because I felt I had to keep back because some of the points that I want to make were already sort of touched upon. And a central notion that will come up in this talk is intimacy, and maybe it will also have an effect on this kind of question of the libidinal that seemed to be floating around. And I'm not saying I have an answer to this difficult question, but in terms of the ideological divides that seem to be typical for the Cold War era, I'm trying to come up with a kind of dialectics that you could describe as that of uncanny siblings. So keep this image of invasion of the body snatchers in mind. I will come to this particular moment in time during my talk, but in the beginning you will maybe not see a connection. The general tenor of emotional life in Moscow, thus forming a lyrical and romantic blend, still stands opposed to the dryness of officialdom, which is a quote from Boris Groys from 1979 from the oft-mentioned Moscow Romantic Conceptualism essay. And it delineates the state of contemporary artistic practice in the Soviet state. In the piece, he discussed the work of, among others, artist group Collective Actions. Founded in 1976 by Andrei Monastyrsky, Georgy Kiesewetter, and Nikita Alexeyev, and later joined by more members, the group devised actions that took place sometimes with spectators, sometimes without spectators, in the countryside, the city, or in private apartments. Organizing conspiratory trips out of town, their initial audience was asked to attend a gathering in the woods or a field where they, for example, as if by chance, came across a ringing bell under the snow. These actions were documented in photographs and short descriptive texts, sometimes other forms of documentation. This translation into factographic elements forms another level of the work, the only one accessible directly to a wider audience, including me, than the one initially present during the realization. I had the pleasure to include a number of these photographs in an exhibition I curated in 2007. It was entitled Romantic Conceptualism. So let me quickly talk about the notion of conceptualism and about what I mean by romanticism. Because here the term became much wider, literally, because the artists included in that show stemmed from different parts of the world. And at the same time, it became maybe more specific because I was specifically referring to the historical romanticism and predominantly German romanticism of the early 19th century. The first methodological characteristics of conceptual art, so I'm trying to delineate my notion of conceptual art here briefly, and I'm sure there have been better ones yesterday, but I'm trying anyway. The first methodological characteristics of conceptual art is that it radically shifts the emphasis from representation to indexicalization. In this alone, it doesn't fundamentally differ from earlier movements of modernist abstraction. Rather than reproducing or illustrating the appearance of something, that something is only evoked through gesture, language, or other indexical means, including literally signs and measures. And while this may imply a devaluation of skill or originality, These seem to be, initially at least, side effects rather than main objectives. Rather, the main objective is to move away from the visual and the phenomenological, or the retinal, as Marcel Duchamp famously put it, to the indexical, pointing to things in an idea-driven way, which does not preclude the use of images as long as they are in the service of this. Secondly, conceptual art usually adheres to a fairly strict reductivist ethos of economy of means. In this alone, it doesn't fundamentally differ from the trajectory that leads from Malevich to minimal art. The idea that to allow this indexicalization to be most effective, it needs to be realized. This is the idea that to allow this indexicalization to be most effective, it needs to be realized with as many elements as needed, but as few as possible. This is at the service of either, like an architectural model or philosophical proposition, strictly securing or closing the meaning, or to the contrary, at the service of allowing the work to become a kind of springboard that opens up the meaning to the viewer's perceptive response and intellectual continuation. A good example for the former strategy is Joseph Kosuth. A good example for the latter, Lawrence Weiner, with Sol LeWitt sitting somewhere in the middle in between. The third point follows directly from the second. Whether the main aim is to achieve a clarity of meaning like Kosuth, or a clarity of the artwork-viewer relationship like Weiner, or a clarity of the work's realization like LeWitt, there's a strong tendency towards dematerialization, which does not mean simply to do away with physical objecthood, but to do away with the cohesiveness of the artwork in terms of where it resides, where it sits, so to speak. In other words, even if an object is involved, a chair, a piece of paper, a file cabinet, or whatever, or the artist's or anyone else's body enacts a gesture or act that is then documented, producing physical residues, then the work may still be constituted neither by this object or this particular body. A relationship between things in the world is stated without necessitating a physical realization of that relationship to constitute the artwork. Rather, it may simply be constituted by the proposition of the artist, or it may reside in the particular way something is situated or conveyed through, for example, the way it is positioned in a space, or publicized through press releases or letters, or invitation cards, catalogs, even a telephone call. Or it may reside in the way the viewers fulfill the work through their way of making use of or responding to it. Or indeed, it may be a mixture of all these three parameters of production, distribution, and reception. The shorthand term for the specificities of this particular mixture would probably simply be context. In other words, dematerialization has the potential to not only be the next logical step of reduction in formalist terms, but almost inevitably leads to a questioning of the way things are made, disseminated, and perceived, with obvious social and political implications. The three fundamental methodologies of conceptual art are intricately connected to two ideologically opposing understandings of authorship. The first of the two is an emphatic affirmation of authorship. Freeing artistic practice from being at the service of representation of the complex phenomenological world or the particularities of physical materiality with the help of indexing, reducing, dematerializing, turns it into a free-floating intellectual endeavor. The artist either turns into a kind of trickster who subverts the authority of the cultural tradition by suspending the parameters by which it is perpetuated, such as skill, composition, preciousness of the object. To give one example, and there's no image for that, is Robert Bэрry's piece, Telepathic piece of 1969, which was his contribution to a group exhibition in Canada, and it consisted of a written statement that he would telepathically transmit the piece as it was not, quote, applicable to language or image, unquote. That's the one possibility of the affirmation of the authorship. The other is an intellectual master who, much like a philosopher, successfully unfolds a system of analysis that enlightens us about the historical obsolescence of these traditions. I guess the young Joseph Kossuth was very much in that vein. Either way, authorship secures the status of these endeavors as art, while making them part of a consistent or at least organized trajectory. The second of the two aims is precisely the opposite, which is to suspend authorship, to get rid of it, basically. Through unhinging artistic practice from representation, from the phenomenological and from object-based materiality, all at the same time, it is freed up, at least that's the utopian idea, towards a collective process. Lawrence Wiener's Declaration of Intent of 1968 was the model case for this, handing over the completion of the work to the audience, or the receiver, as he called it, namely in the way it replaced the common imperative of performative instruction pieces, do this, do that, with a conditional form, the piece may be. As said, of course, the conundrum remains that the one who declares the suspension of authorship paradoxically asserts his or her authorship of just that declaration. Wiener's declaration demonstrates that the two seemingly opposing aims of securing and suspending authorship can sometimes be found in one artist's oeuvre, or even in one work. In any case, whether trickster or master, whether self-aggrandizing or self-effacing collectivist, all these approaches and methodologies ultimately serve the aim to enlighten, or less dramatically put, to generate thought and inform. This may be done through straight address or through allusion, innuendo. It may involve propositions about art or about the world. It may lean towards the declarative or the performative. It may employ language as its main medium, or it may not. Either way, the task is to artistically shape that process of communication, especially if no physical or visual elements are shaped, and to somehow make sure it takes place according to plan, even if that plan involves varying levels of contingency. So that's important to know that it's not just a shift from form to content, it's the shaping of communication. However, there remains the paradox of an attempt to open up the communication by closing it down, tightly defining its parameters. Who has the authority to define these parameters? Especially if we're not talking only about a single artist's work, but about an artistic movement. It is therefore the suggestion of artist Louis Kamnitzer, whom, as a German Jewish immigrant to Uruguay, lived in New York since the late 60s, as put forth in the context of the exhibition project Global Conceptualism of 1999, to adopt the term conceptualism rather than conceptual art, which is then understood to be reserved for a relatively small group of artists from Europe and North America, favoring a more purist understanding of the practice, this term conceptual art, and instead to opt for conceptualism as defining a varied field of activities from around the world that share a certain reductivist attitude, turning art making into a means of communication set free from purposes of representation and material presence, and not only for formalist, but crucially for economic and social reasons of avoiding unnecessary material expenses and labor. That was the argument of Louis Kamnitzer. It is this broader definition that I've tried to follow with romantic conceptualism, however, bringing in that aspect of romanticism. But what about romanticism? What do I mean by that? In brief, not a synonym for the kitsch of love and desire, in other words, the common use of the word romantic, but an abbreviation for the cultural techniques of emotion and for ideas of the fragmentary and the open that can be traced back to the days of early, particularly German, but also English or French romanticism, but are, as I would argue, still present and prevalent today. But isn't romanticism the very antithesis of conceptualism? Yes and no. If conceptualism is understood as dialectical, as much about what it says as about what it doesn't say, as much about pure information as it is about the impure hybrid quality of artistic thought, then there are very interesting connections. Historically, Romanticism was, at least in parts, an explicit, intelligent critique of the kind of thinking which supplied the ideological legitimization for the logic of material constraints and power struggles that were an essential part of the emergence of industrialization and mass society. It also built on the conclusions that Friedrich Schiller drew from the terror regime that ruled as the immediate aftermath of the French Revolution, expressed in his very influential series of letters on the aesthetic education of man of 1795, in which he called for an aesthetic revolution built on allowing individuals to develop their perceptive qualities, a totalization of aesthetic experience, in effect proposing a merging of art and life. In this sense, Romanticism is not simply an opponent of Enlightenment, but its reflective side as an experimental and at times ironic counterpart to a systematic, rationalist concept of reason. Friedrich Schlegel was arguably early Romanticism's most eminent voice. As Walter Benjamin noted in his groundbreaking study, The Concept of Criticism in German Romanticism, Schlegel is first and foremost concerned with, I quote Walter Benjamin, reflective thinking which won its special systematic importance by virtue of that limitless capacity by which it makes every prior reflection into the object of a subsequent reflection, unquote. This expressed an important aspect of Romanticism, favoring the fragmentary and the open over the systematic and the conclusive, allowing the mind to adjust to a contradictory reality instead of doing the opposite and fitting reality to its own parameters. This is also why, in the words of Philippe Lacoue-Labarthe and Jean-Luc Nancy, I quote, "The fragment is the romantic genre par excellence," unquote. Each fragment, they argue, in regard to the romanticist conception of the literary text, I quote again, stands for itself and for that from which it is detached, which is an infinite plurality of other options. This is also at the heart of Schlegel's idea of romantic irony. It's the humble awareness that anything we analyze and conclude is unfinishable vis-à-vis the infinite chaos of possibilities. Well, what are the implications of all this for conceptual art then? Sol LeWitt's paragraphs on conceptual art from 1967 includes the following, quote, "It is the objective of the artist who is concerned with conceptual art to make his work mentally interesting to the spectator, and therefore usually he would want it to become emotionally dry," unquote. But 2 years later, in 1969, Sol LeWitt published his Sentences on Conceptual Art in the first issue of Art Language magazine, in a context where Marxism, linguistics, and analytical philosophy were dominant. He turned against a purely rationalistic understanding of conceptual art. In the first of 35 sentences, he proclaimed, "Conceptual artists are mystics rather than rationalists. They leap to conclusions that logic cannot reach," unquote. This is a striking parallel to what Walter Benjamin said of the Romantics' notion of criticism. I quote Benjamin, "To be critical meant to elevate thinking so far beyond all restrictive conditions that the knowledge of truth sprang forth magically, as it were, from inside into the falsehood of these restrictions. Unquote. Still, in terms of Sol LeWitt's statement about the necessity of emotional dryness, why should a viewer not be able to find a work mentally interesting and be touched by it emotionally? And how should one make sure not to be touched by the mystic's leaps to conclusions? In an attempt to distinguish the humble, anti-monumentalist stance of conceptual art from the sublime of abstract expressionism, LeWitt threw out the baby with the bathwater, the emotional with the expressional. As I've tried to demonstrate with the exhibition and catalog Romantic Conceptualism, the work not only of artists such as Bas Jan Ader or Collective Actions, but also of so-called core members of neo-conceptual art such as Robert Bэрri can be understood in terms of addressing the romanticist complex of affect and idea, finitude and the infinite, but with astute knowledge that one has to circumvent the self-aggrandizing tendencies of the artist, blowing up the ego to sublime proportion to do so. Early Romanticism didn't necessarily promote the idea of the solitary artist's genius being the sole source of what makes the artwork function the way it does in the first place. So, Friedrich Schlegel's text on incomprehensibility of 1800, for example, puts forth the idea that ironic modes of writing continue to release new meanings for hundreds of years after the writer has died. That was in 1800. Which brings us back to collective actions. Here, the sublime was not residing in the solitary genius, but in the collective, or rather in their actions. In any case, the two pieces I had the privilege to include in the exhibition were The Slogan of 1977, which involved a red banner that was hung between trees on a hill in the countryside outside Moscow. The slogan read, the English translation, "I do not complain about anything, and I almost like it here, although I have never been here before and I know nothing about this place." It's a quote from André Monastirski's book, Nothing Happens. I love that humble sound of that. The other, and funny sound of that. The other piece was Balloon of 1977, the same year. Pieces of calico, a kind of cotton fabric, were sewn together to form a balloon, stuffed with inflated toy balloons and a ringing electric bell. The object was then left to drift down the Klyarsma River outside Moscow. The ephemeral character of these works brought artists and audience together in situations that hovered midway between imaginativeness and blankness, austerity and irony. In the same year, 2007, in which I did my exhibition and included these historic works, Collective Actions realized a performance, again in a winter landscape outside Moscow, entitled Deutsche Romantiker, German Romantics, 2007. It had the German title, as far as I understand. Which, amongst other elements, involved I'm sorry, I don't have a photograph of this work. Which, amongst other elements, involved period portraits of famous romantics such as Adalbert von Chamisso, Bettina von Arnim, or Novalis being affixed to trees. I couldn't help but think of this beautiful piece as a witty nod to the premise I had made the basis of the Romantic Conceptual exhibition, that there are some interesting parallels between the German Romantics and artists working in the realm of international conceptualism since the 1960s, but that making that connection also deserves to be released from the all too serious. I feel I should acknowledge here in Moscow and here in this room are people in a far better position than me to say something valuable and insightful about the history of Moscow conceptualism. I have an inevitably fractured perspective for at least two reasons. The first is that mine is an inevitably Western perspective that, even with a broadening of recent years, cannot deny its roots in forming first experiences that have a lot to do with Anglo-Saxon and, I guess, West German affinities in art and pop cultures, in places from Warhol's New York and Roxy Music's London to Sigmar Polke's Cologne and Rainer Werner Fassbinder's Munich or Theodor Adorno's Frankfurt. The second reason is that I don't read Russian, crucial sources not translated into English or German are not available for me. It's a bit absurd then for me that I have decided to bring in a number of arguments concerning the international context of conceptualism, concerning a number of artists from a number of countries such as Czechoslovakia or today Czech Republic, namely Irži Kovanda, and from Italy, namely Giovanni Anselmo, but also, for example, Croatian artist Tomislav Gotovac. For I don't speak much Czech or Italian or Croatian either. Nevertheless, I feel it might be precisely valuable for once to look at these works not entirely from the perspective of immediate historical context, but more formally in the wider context of global developments during Cold War times. So in reference to that earlier discussion today, that doesn't mean to say, okay, I'm looking at human existence and the basic universal facts of life, but it means that I'm trying to figure out whether there are broader intellectual, ideological parameters and formative elements in place that, to put it simply, go beyond borders, that are transnational at least. So I'm not trying to diminish the specific qualities of either Moscow conceptualism or any other movement, but I'm trying to look at these affinities from the viewpoint I will try to develop in reference to Richard Zennett's notion of the public. Anyway, so even if I don't go deeper into that history of collective actions group, I discuss these other artists with them in mind. Even if I hesitate to jump to conclusions about what the parallels and differences between their work might mean about the time and place they were created in, I do think that it's worth to discuss all of them together, to point out things that were in the air, so to speak, in different parts of Europe and the world, on this and the other side of the Iron Curtain. What I'm trying to aim at is the question of the relationship between the inwardness of the artistic poetic self and the outwardness, the orientation towards the outside of artistic communication, and the way that relationship is situated in a respective political paradigm of the public sphere. What kind of encounters between people are really possible? What is the possibility of intimacy? I think all of the artists I will discuss in one way or other are asking that question with their work. What is the possibility of intimacy between people? So what's that big deal about intimacy? In the age of internet dating, social network websites, self-management guidebooks, reality TV shows with surveillance cameras, I cheated on my husband chat shows, or Paris Hilton porn download, the very idea of intimacy feels like a nostalgic fantasy. Intimacy is simultaneously non-existent in the sense of securing actual privacy, and flooded with narcissist exaltation and public attention. Intimacy turned inside out. Feelings, affections, desires, secrets are on display for everyone to see. Does that mean that before the advent of digital capitalist media machineries, something like true intimacy existed during socialist times, less Western capitalist times? The answers, I would guess, is not clear-cut. It was in 1974, when the Cold War ideological system was still securely in place, or so it seemed, that the American sociologist Richard Zennett first published his influential book, The Fall of Public Man. Just to remind, it was the year that President Nixon had to resign because of the Watergate scandal after conversations in the White House had been taped. And it was the time of economic stagnation in the USSR, while repression of anti-government activities was secured by the KGB, holding Brezhnev securely in power. Zennett's argument, in simplified terms, is that Western societies had lost the balance between private and public life that had briefly been in place during the 18th century and at the heat of the Age of Enlightenment. According to Zennett, with a set of relatively strict social codes of distance and respect, an actually satisfying emotional connection to others in public was still possible, while the tendency in the following centuries towards a more self-indulgent, navel-gazing understanding of the individual's psychological and emotional makeup had proven, I quote Richard Zennett, to be a trap rather than a liberation. Intimacy connotes warmth, trust, and open expression of feeling. But precisely because so much social life, which does have a meaning, cannot yield these psychological rewards, the world outside, the impersonal world, seems to fail us, seems to be stale and empty. Western societies are moving from something like an other-directed condition to an inner-directed condition, except that in the midst of self-absorption, no one can say what it is inside. As a result, confusion has arisen between public and intimate life. People are working out in terms of personal feelings public matters, which probably can be dealt with only through codes of impersonal meaning, unquote. Zennett, Richard Zennett, born in 1943, grew up in a bohemian, proletarian, radically left 1950s Chicago milieu. And McCarthyism, the surveillance of everyday life in the US for signs of supposed communist traitors, was a part of his experience even as a schoolboy. In the cinemas, there were films like Invasion of the Body Snatchers of 1956, in which an alien force is duplicating people, replacing them with coldly unemotional doppelgangers. This film was, at the time and later, either read as an allegory of people during the McCarthy era giving in to mindless conformity, becoming McCarthyists, or, to the very contrary, as a film about communist infiltration of the US. In this sense, McCarthy America and Stalin Soviet Union were indeed uncanny siblings. They were projecting onto each other emotional numbness. Therefore, it is not really that surprising that Zennett also makes out an uncanny sibling to the tyranny of intimacy that he describes, which is the rule of narcissism and the confession of the self in the Western public, this tyranny of intimacy. And that sibling, that uncanny sibling, is the intimacy of tyranny, as he calls it, the paranoid system of surveillance and denunciation that characterized both McCarthyism in the West and Stalinism in the East, though the latter was much more extreme in this respect. In the final chapter of Zennett's book, it's Flaubert's Madame Bovary, with her ennui, depression, desperate desire for luxury and riches, that Zennett describes as the tragic emblem of the tyranny of intimacy. Whereas the emblem of the intimacy of tyranny would be, I quote Zennett, the Stalinist legend of the good little communist who turned his parents into the secret police, unquote. Richard Zennett's point, however, is that tyranny doesn't need to take the form of brutal force. It can also work by way of seduction. I think we've heard that word before today. Which I guess is the point where the tyranny of intimacy, this Western model, and the intimacy of tyranny, this supposedly Eastern model, become one. From having followed the developments, to give a contemporary example, of Silvio Berlusconi's Italy over the last years, with its strange combination of voyeurism and corruption, I can say that it's certainly the case there. I'm sure there are other countries currently as well where you can describe similar phenomena. Richard Zennett was a student of Hannah Arendt, and his skepticism towards the public display of psychic matters was clearly influenced by her. The central distinction that runs through Hannah Arendt's entire philosophy presents us with, to put it in very broad terms, the psychological confession of the self as being a fundamental hindrance to the political emancipation of sovereign humans, able to develop feelings of social interconnectedness. For Hannah Arendt, the question is whether the psychic self is a reliable source of emancipation to start with. Her deep-seated skepticism of German Romanticism, understood as a movement hailing the importance of the psychic self, is laid out already in her first major work, the biography of Rahel Varnhagen. Varnhagen was a key figure of early Romanticism in Germany, a German Jewish writer hosting a salon in Berlin around 1800 that became the meeting place for eminent figures such as the Schlegel brothers, Schelling, Schleiermacher, Alexander and Wilhelm von Humboldt, Ludwig Tieck, to name but a few. Written in Germany from 1929 to 1933 and completed in exile in France in 1938, it wasn't until 1958 that the book was published, Rahel Varnhagen, The Life of a Jewess. Under the impression of the fascist escalation of anti-Semitism, Arendt studied Varnhagen's life and letters in regard to the difficult issue of Jewish assimilation. In short, her point is that Romanticism offered Varnhagen a deceptive way out from the pressures of negating her own Jewish identity. Why that? Because Romanticism, according to Arendt, severs reflection from fact. Severs reflection from fact. And love from the object of love, while offering up the intimate as public in the form of indiscreet speculation and gossip. Reason and emotion become free-floating, an all-pervasive fantasy. In short, Romanticism is portrayed not only as escapist, but as a seduction to Jewish self-neglect. Hannah Arendt at points almost sounds, though she expressively intends to always show respect for Varnhagen, like an older sister ridiculing her younger sibling for being caught up with pubescent chimera, with, as she calls it, Wunschphantasmagorien, wishful phantasmagorias. One can understand Arendt's frustration with Varnhagen's continuing repudiation of her Jewish background. But the big question is whether it's really early Romanticism that is to blame for it. Varnhagen's salon, and one could say Romanticism in its true sense, ends with Napoleon seizing Prussia. In that short period between the 1790s and 1806, Jewish salons like that of Varnhagen for the metropolitan intelligentsia offered a kind of utopian retreat from the strict social orders and conventions. Arendt readily describes it this way, but holds this against these salons, saying they were merely stopgaps, Lückenbüßer, between a, quote, a perishing and a not yet stabilized form of conviviality, unquote. This stabilized form would be the so-called German dinner party, established in 1811 by, amongst others, Achim von Arnim, the husband of Bettina von Arnim, who was a friend of Varnhagen. It precluded women and Jews from joining, and in the wake of the Jews' Edict of 1812 granting basic civil rights to Jews in Prussia, was a hotbed of anti-Semitism. But does that mean that the world of the Jewish salons until the catastrophe of 1806 was merely illusionist, as Arendt states? It seems that to denounce early Romanticism for this historic development towards a resurgence of patriotism and anti-Semitism in Prussia of the 1810s, and for Varnhagen's increasing neglect of her Jewish heritage, is again to throw out the baby with the bathwater. Wasn't Varnhagen's salon an actual and very real, consistent counterexample to the nationalist, chauvinist backlash of the German dinner party? Not only in regard to the emancipation of Jewish intellectuals, but also women intellectuals, a point that Arendt curiously and consistently ignores. Yeah, I'll hurry up. One can't help but think that Romanticism that Arendt despises in Varnhagen is the Romanticism of her own time, the amplified and overblown Wagnerian sublime that became a tool of Nazism. And this is where the notion of romantic conceptualism comes into play. It has a kind of inbuilt anti-theatricality. It is interested in evoking the sublime, but dismisses the self-indulgent show-offiness that comes into play once it is actually evoked. And I do think that also applies to Moscow romantic conceptualism. Precisely for the sake of saving the imaginative space that Romanticism opens up, Romantic conceptualists circumvented its tendencies of self-obsession, of locating essence purely and only in the artist's soul. The idea of the open artwork demands this. If meaning is to be established through interaction with the viewer, then some sort of humility, humbleness on the part of the artist comes inevitably into play. Maybe this is also why romantic conceptualism sometimes comes across as the shy sibling of physical comedy. Both undermine magnitude, whether it's the magnitude of Wagnerian sublimity or Kant's moral superiority. Thinking about Zennett's tyranny of intimacy versus the intimacy of tyranny, one of the artists that I have to think of is Czech artist Irži Kovanda. I think it cannot be pure coincidence, despite Kovanda's insistence that he's not a political artist, that in the mid-1970s he located his actions in Prague's public realm. This was the time, obviously, when the counterculture that had developed despite of the drowning out of the Prague Spring movement had come under intense repression by the state again, which triggered the human rights initiative of the Charter 77, which in turn led to even harsher reactions by the regime. Against this background, it is understandable that Kovanda doesn't want his artistic endeavor to be confused with or absorbed by the idea of this just protest, as it would be an all too one-dimensional reading, both of his project as that of the Charter 77 movement. But that shouldn't preclude one from seeing the work in the context of its time. All the more so with Zennett's very fundamental sociological observations in mind, which as described resonated, albeit in different registers, with conditions on both sides of the Iron Curtain. And incidentally, the question of the connection between intimacy and control hasn't gone away under post-socialist conditions. It just has migrated into a substantial extent into the fields of media and commerce. Kovanda's aesthetic project has always been to make these two reciprocal phenomena, tyranny of intimacy, intimacy of tyranny, silently collide. Some of Kovanda's contemporaries in Eastern Europe may have had similar aims in this respect. Artists such as Karel Miller and Peter Stembra, the former in a more restrained manner closer to Kovanda, the latter in a more self-mutilating way, displacing the intimacy of tyranny to their own physical body. But so had Western artists. Chris Burden comes to mind, or Bas Jan Ader. Kovanda negated any theatricality with clear and careful determination. Intimate, but reserved and discreet, invading one's public social demeanor of numbed indifference, but in the most modest and inoppressive way. Moments of possible actual sensuous intimacy between individuals are presented in a non-narrative and factual rather than confessional and psychologizing manner. And while moments of public apathy are suddenly broken up like a ripe fruit through a simple, tiny gesture, a gaze, arms raised, this occurs precisely through the avoidance of spelling things out. The normalization is achingly made visible not through the violent, symbolic act, but through an ever so slight gradual shift. Kovanda's humility is a means to achieve this, a way to circumvent the posture of the heroic artist that otherwise would get in the way of the work. This touches directly on the question of the legitimacy of the artist. Kovanda hadn't studied art, and making a living of it was out of the question for a very long time. Not that he was a so-called outsider artist. It was more like he sneaked something in gradually over the years. From 1977 until 1995, he worked in the depository of the Czech National Gallery, but that was more like living in the belly of the beast in terms of his own artistic work. In any case, his actions were not commissioned by anyone. They remained as discreet in terms of their status as in terms of their actual artistic gesture. Some of Kovanda's actions executed in the open public environment of the city, Prague, are equally ephemeral. For example, Theater, November 1976, which took place on Wenceslas Square. For this piece, that's a different piece than the one on display here. For this piece, he followed a previously written script to the letter. Gestures and movements have been selected so that passerby will not suspect that they're watching a performance, unquote. Or another one, untitled, this one, which also took place on Wenceslas Square. Kovanda interacts more actively. No, that was, sorry, I got confused here. This is, that's the one I earlier showed, this one. Untitled. Kovanda interacts more actively with anonymous passers-by, standing on with outstretched arms. No, that's, this is the one where he stands on an elevator, looking someone in the eye. It's obviously no coincidence that these pieces, in the public realm and yet resisting to reveal anything, take place on Prague's Wenceslas Square. This is where many historical events occurred, from the Declaration of Independence of 1918 through student Jan Palach setting himself on fire in protest against the Soviet invasion in '68, to the demonstrations of the Velvet Revolution in '89. But this doesn't mean that Kovanda claims his actions to be explicit political allegories. For him, the artist is his or her own audience to start with. But Kovanda also made works that directly involve the participation of small groups of people. Now we're at this work, which makes me think of the Collective Actions Group. One of his best-known pieces is in an action that was realized on January 23, 1978, and he describes it this way, quote, "I arranged to meet a few friends. We were standing in a small group on the square, talking. Suddenly, I started running. I raced across the square and disappeared into Melantric Street," unquote. The photograph shows a group of 7 gathered in a circle, 3 of them looking at a book, while the other 4 are gazing after Kovanda running away from them. Italian artist Giovanni Anselmo, usually associated with the arte povera movement, may seem removed from conceptualism. A large amount of his pieces are emphatically concerned with materiality rather than dematerialization, with physical rather than merely mental, quote-unquote, merely mental or indexical tensions, with intuitive approaches to handling objects and spaces rather than pronouncedly analytical approaches, all of which are qualities that would disqualify you for being a conceptualist. Yet some key works of Anselmo's are precisely not about the physically present but the absent, about alluding to something with a fragmentary gesture or word rather than a physically charged object. Starting with what has been described as his epiphany at the start of his artistic career. A small color photograph documents the event. The artist standing there, still, with white trousers and shoes, in a steeply slanting black lava field, behind him smoke and a small volcano eruption, the blue sea and the sky. The picture is accompanied by the following statement, quote, "My shadow projected to infinity on the top of Stromboli during sunrise on 16 August 1965, unquote. Anselmo had climbed to the top of the volcanic island that is part of the Aeolic Islands north of Sicily, and had realized that even though the rising sunlight hit him at a low angle, since he was standing on a slope against the background of the sea, there was no surface on which a shadow could fall. The event marks the initiation of Anselmo into his artistic practice, the photograph and text in turn framing that moment of epiphany, which could be read to mean that neither the event nor its documentation, strictly speaking, are themselves a part of Anselmo's oeuvre. Of course, one can see the concern with basic physical qualities and energies in this initiative moment on top of a volcano. But there's also a counter-movement to the famous romantic motif of Caspar David Friedrich's solitary figure as seen from behind in nature. That figure here being the artist himself turning towards the viewer, while at the same time impersonating the viewer beholding nature. One is also tempted to point out parallels to French-German romanticist Adalbert von Chamisso's famous story of Peter Schlemihl of 1813, the man who sold his shadow, his soul, to the devil for a sack of gold. Only that Anselmo did the opposite, suspending his shadow for the sake of a poor art, arte povera. I'm coming to the end very soon. Or take, for example, Giovanni Anselmo's piece Interferenza nella gravitazione universale, Effect on the Gravity of the Universe, 1969. It is what the accompanying work description states. Quote, 20 photos taken at intervals of 20 paces while walking towards the setting sun, unquote. Anselmo's set of small black and white photographs quite clearly set themselves apart from the kitsch residue of this romantic trope par excellence, the tourist sunsets of myriad of postcards and panorama wallpapers. At the same time, the series of photos is taken according to a strictly numerical plan, 20 photos, 20 paces. What is revealed here to be at the heart of conceptual practice, whether with Anselmo or Kovanda, is the tension that is associated with Schlegel's notion of poetry and romantic irony. I quote Schlegel, "Romantic poetry, more than any other form, can hover at midpoint between the portrayed and the portrayer, free of all real and ideal self-interest, on the wings of poetic reflection, and can raise that reflection again and again to a higher power, can multiply it in an endless succession of mirrors. Romantic poetry is in the arts what wit is in philosophy," unquote. Schlegel's notion of romantic poetry of 1800 bears surprising parallels to conceptual art making of the 60s onwards, in that both testify to a realization of a sense of disjunction between the inevitable fragmentary attempts to describe the world and the infinite world itself, of a need to resolve that disjunction not by presenting an ideal of epic synthetic unity, but by way of a scattered practice that reflects on its own character of reflection. To give one last example from yet another political and geographical context, that of Yugoslavia of the 1960s, where I guess the libidinal and the non-libidinal were really colliding in one space. Tomislav Gotovac is an outstanding figure of experimental film conceptualism and performance in and outside of ex-Yugoslavia. Straight Line is a 16mm film he realized in 1964. A camera is positioned in the window of a tram so that we see the long straight tracks which run along the street in one long static shot. We see people crossing the tracks, cars rushing by, nothing spectacular, just everyday life. But long before TV stations would adopt these kinds of mesmerizing scenes. In 1971, he realized the first streaking, running naked through the streets of Belgrade, and in the following decades continued to make films and performances. But the early piece, Showing L, documents a situation the artist set up in 1962 on a winter trip to the mountain of Slimi outside Zagreb. The 6 black and white images that comprise the series form a kind of mini film. We see the artist amidst trees, partly undressed, while he wears dark trousers, with snow in the background, leafing through a French edition of Elle magazine. He holds up an image of a woman in underwear, laughs. Some images show him alone, others reveal 3 people, friends presumably, standing in the background. Signification slips and slides, the distance of nature and consumer society, and the distance of communism and consumer society for that matter, is bypassed comically, as is the distance between genders, bodies, the artist, his audience. All of that packed into a simple, wry gesture, photographically documented. To come to a conclusion, what seems obvious here is that in many of the works discussed, the public is tested as a terrain for intimacy, precisely because intimacy is not protected anymore by a strict sense of the private. What these artists maybe have in common is that they test the limits of intimacy by communicating them, albeit not as a confession, but as an act of deviance that says, yes, I have feelings, but what precisely they are, I will not confess. I think that's also at the core of saying it's not, we don't know sex, but we know fucking. I think that's at the core of it. I take part in the game of self-exposure, but in that very act, I manifest my insistence on an autonomous sphere of thought. What remains is the gesture, the act, the communication, not the confession of the artistic soul. Thank you. And sorry for running over time.